If I asked you to picture the birthplace of the modern industrial factory, what comes to mind?
Most people would probably imagine a massive, multi-story brick building, right?
Exactly. Sitting next to a river in 19th century England, you might picture smog filling the air, the deafening roar of steam-powered looms.
Thousands of workers moving in strict synchronization to the demands of heavy machinery.
Right, because that is the history we were all taught in school. The traditional timeline tells us that industrial mass production began in places like Manchester or Birmingham, driven entirely by European domestic ingenuity.
But what if that entire timeline is off by, well, several centuries?
That is exactly what we are going to explore. What if the true prototype for the modern factory system was not built in a cold, northern European city, but rather under a punishing tropical sun?
It completely shifts our understanding of economic history.
It really does. So, today we are taking a deep dive into the architecture of the Atlantic sugar economy. We're going to completely dismantle that prevailing myth about the origins of modern capitalism.
And to do this, we are drawing extensively upon a foundational historical essay published by Paper Connections.
Right, it's titled Saint-Domingue and the Architecture of the Atlantic Sugar Economy, 1493 to 1791.
It is a remarkable piece of scholarship. It provides a staggering macroeconomic framework, allowing us to see exactly how three distinct continents were bound together.
Bound together into a single, highly leveraged, violently efficient financial machine.
Exactly. It forces us to look at agriculture not merely as farming, but as the world's first true heavy industry.
However, before we begin mapping out these global supply chains and European credit markets, we have to establish a crucial parameter for this deep dive.
Yes, this is absolutely vital.
Throughout this analysis, we are going to be discussing staggering economic data. We will be looking at imperial profit margins, complex banking syndicates, and the sheer volume of global trade.
And we will examine these mechanisms with strict, objective rigor to understand exactly how they functioned.
But we must explicitly state right here at the outset that every single data point we discuss was built entirely upon a foundation of unprecedented human subjugation.
It is a solemn, horrifying historical reality. The transatlantic slave trade and the violence of the colonial plantation system constitute a monumental tragedy in human civilization.
Every localized economic boom, every massive European fortune was extracted through the systemic, calculated destruction of millions of lives.
By focusing our lens on the financial and architectural mechanics of this system today, we are certainly not looking past that suffering.
No, not at all. Rather, we are exposing the cold, terrifyingly rational economic logic that institutionalized that suffering on a global scale.
Precisely. We have to understand the machine to understand the scale of the devastation.
With that deeply important context anchoring our discussion, let's start at the very beginning. If we want to understand how the Americas were transformed into a global agro-industrial complex, we actually cannot start with economics.
Right, we have to start with biology.
Take us back to the late 15th century, right at the moment of initial European contact. Why did the arrival of the Spanish trigger such an immediate, catastrophic demographic collapse?
Well, to understand that, you have to look at the world through the biological framework articulated by researchers like Jared Diamond.
The guns, germs, and steel framework.
Exactly. For thousands of years, populations across Europe and Asia had lived in extremely close proximity to domesticated livestock: cows, pigs, sheep, horses.
And because of that sustained proximity, those populations endured waves of zoonotic diseases.
Yes, and over millennia, they developed natural immunological defenses to a wide host of pathogens.
But the indigenous populations of the Americas, specifically the Taino and Arawak peoples of the Caribbean basin, lived in a completely different biological reality.
Entirely different. They were geographically isolated by vast oceans and had very few domesticated animals.
So they possessed absolutely no immunological memory or defense against Eurasian pathogens.
None. When the Spanish arrived, it was certainly a military conquest, but more fundamentally, it was an epidemiological collision.
An epidemiological collision. I like that phrasing.
The introduction of highly contagious viruses, specifically smallpox, measles, and influenza, swept through the Caribbean with a lethality that is almost impossible to comprehend today.
And we have to compound that biological vulnerability with the brutal forced labor systems the Spanish immediately implemented.
Systems like the encomienda.
Right. The Spanish essentially divided up the indigenous population and forced them to mine for gold or clear land under horrific conditions.
The combination of relentless forced labor, malnutrition, and novel pathogens resulted in an absolute demographic collapse. Entire islands were depopulated in a matter of decades,
From an economic perspective, the Spanish had claimed vast, fertile territories, but they had inadvertently destroyed the very labor force they intended to exploit.
which created a massive, immediate vacuum.
I know the Spanish initially tried to fill that vacuum by importing indentured labor from Europe, but that failed completely, didn't it?
It was an economic disaster for the colonial planners. The European indentured servants simply could not survive the Caribbean climate.
Because they lacked immunity to endemic tropical diseases.
Exactly. Diseases like yellow fever and malaria. The mortality rates for European laborers were so high that paying for their transatlantic transport became financially non-viable.
They were dying long before they could generate any return on the investment of their passage.
So European capital owners are sitting on incredibly valuable land, but they cannot work it themselves, and they have decimated the native population.
This is where we see a cold, terrifying economic calculus take hold.
Exactly. The colonial planners analyzed their requirements. They needed a massive workforce.
And that workforce needed to possess deep, generational expertise in intense, tropical agriculture.
Crucially, yes.
Yeah.
And they required a much higher degree of physiological endurance and natural immunity to the specific pathogens endemic to hot equatorial climates.
This brutal calculus is what led directly to the systematic transoceanic enslavement of African populations.
It wasn't merely a matter of convenience. It was a highly targeted demographic extraction.
West African populations possessed the specific agricultural knowledge and the biological resilience that European capital demanded to make these tropical territories profitable.
And this specific point forces us to confront a massive debate among historians regarding the true definition and origin of capitalism itself.
Right. If you read the traditionalist school of thought championed by economic historians like David Landis, they focus entirely on what we call endogenous European factors.
Endogenous meaning factors that originated internally within Europe.
Yes, this is the idea that Europe got rich strictly by pulling itself up by its own bootstraps. They point to the Protestant work ethic, domestic technological innovation, internal capital accumulation,
The intellectual ferment of the Enlightenment, and so on. The classic narrative of domestic ingenuity.
But Harvard historian Sven Becker completely shatters that framework. He introduces a concept he calls war capitalism.
Beckert argues convincingly that you cannot explain the massive leap into modern industrial capitalism by just looking at European domestic policy.
He argues that the true launchpad for the modern economy was the violent imperialist domination of global commodity networks.
The mass expropriation of foreign land, and above all, the forced mobilization of enslaved labor.
Think about it like this, and this is an analogy I find incredibly helpful when trying to visualize this shift. We are conditioned to think of the factory system as something that emerged in the 1800s.
Right, the Manchester mills.
But look at a Caribbean sugar plantation in the 1600s. For the very first time in human history, you have capital owners organizing heavy, expensive machinery.
They are deploying massive amounts of investment capital.
And they're organizing a massive labor force from scratch, imposing strict, synchronized time discipline to create a continuous mass production regime.
It is the exact blueprint of a factory assembly line.
Yes, but it was invented centuries early, and the fuel it burned was human life.
That is a perfect visualization. The level of industrial synchronization required to harvest, crush, and boil sugarcane before the juices ferment and spoil is effectively a high-speed assembly line.
You cannot stop the process once it starts.
Exactly. So if the Caribbean sugar plantation was the prototype for this industrial capitalist model, we need to trace exactly who built the very first rudimentary version of it.
And to find that first blueprint, we have to look at Christopher Columbus's second voyage in 1493.
Most people focus on his first voyage, but the second voyage is where the economic architecture begins.
Columbus arrived back in Hispaniola, the massive island that today comprises the Dominican Republic and Haiti, with a formidable fleet of 17 ships.
Crucially, tucked away in the cargo holds of those ships were sugarcane cuttings taken from the Canary Islands.
They didn't waste any time. If you read the historical accounts from figures like Bartolomé de las Casas or Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo, you see sugar cultivation taking root almost instantly.
Oviedo actually specifically identifies a Catalan man named Miguel Ballester as the very first colonial to successfully cultivate the cane and extract sugar juice on Hispaniola.
The technological progression was remarkably swift. Initially, they tried to extract the juice using primitive methods, essentially copying the design of ancient Mediterranean olive presses.
It was slow and highly inefficient.
But by 1516, Ballester and another pioneer named Gonzalo de Velosa had constructed the first true trapiches in the New World.
Let's explain what a trapiche is, because the machinery really matters here.
Right, these were large, heavy mills powered by animals, correct?
Yes, they utilized horses or oxen walking in endless circles to turn heavy wooden crushing cylinders.
It is amazing to think that by 1514, the records show there were already 28 commercial-scale sugar plantations operating on Hispaniola.
They are clearly the vanguard.
But here's the historical puzzle. Despite being first to market, the Spanish completely failed to scale this industry to its true global potential. Why did the Spanish blueprint stall out so early?
The failure was fundamentally macroeconomic. The Spanish crown essentially developed a severe case of shiny object syndrome.
They became utterly distracted by the pursuit of immediate, highly liquid wealth.
Yes. Once they discovered the immense, seemingly bottomless silver deposits in Potosi, in modern-day Bolivia, and the massive gold reserves in Mexico, their entire imperial focus shifted
Entirely to precious metal extraction. Building an agricultural industry became a secondary, almost neglected afterthought.
But it wasn't just a lack of attention, was it? It was a profound lack of financial infrastructure.
Exactly. If you want to build a fully operational industrial-scale sugar mill, you are looking at massive capital expenditures.
You need enormous copper boiling vats that have to be cast in Eurus and shipped across an ocean.
You need heavy iron for the crushing rollers. You need to hire specialized engineers to build the aqueducts.
And you simply cannot finance that kind of heavy industrial infrastructure without a sophisticated, reliable, long-term credit market.
Precisely. And the Spanish crown was notorious for its terrible financial management. They operated in a constant state of massive overextension.
They were funding endless dynastic wars across Europe.
And to pay for them, they've routinely defaulted on their sovereign debt owed to their Genoese and German bankers.
Because the Spanish state was such a massive credit risk, there was very little long-term, stable private capital available to lend to a Spanish planter trying to build a sugar mill in the Caribbean.
So because Spain lacked the financial sophistication to scale the industry, the initiative naturally passed to a different colonial power.
By the year 1600, it was actually the Portuguese in Brazil who had taken the Spanish prototype and successfully scaled it into a massive industry.
The Portuguese certainly had a major geographical advantage. They controlled the vast, incredibly fertile, arable land along the northeastern coast of Brazil.
But their true innovation was not agricultural. It was logistical.
The Portuguese are the ones who truly built the macroeconomic triangulation of trade.
We hear the phrase triangular trade a lot, but let's really break down the mechanics of how it functioned as a continuous self-funding loop of capital accumulation.
Walk us through a single cycle of this massive economic engine.
Think of it as a massive transoceanic conveyor belt. The outward passage departed from European ports.
The ships were heavily loaded with manufactured goods.
Yes. Textiles, firearms, copper rods, iron tools, and luxury goods. These ships sailed south to the West African coast.
There, European merchants exchanged these manufactured goods with local African elites and brokers for enslaved human beings.
Then comes the second leg, the Middle Passage. This is the horrific, unspeakably brutal transoceanic transport of those enslaved populations across the Atlantic to the Americas.
The mortality rates during this crossing were catastrophic, reflecting the absolute dehumanization of the entire enterprise.
Upon arrival in the Americas, in this era, primarily Brazil, the surviving enslaved individuals were sold to plantation owners.
The ships were then scrubbed out and completely reloaded for the homeward passage.
They were packed with the extracted raw commodities, sugar, molasses, raw cotton, and indigo. The ships sailed back to European ports.
And here's the crucial financial mechanism. The sale of those raw commodities in European markets generated massive capital surpluses.
That immense profit didn't just sit in a vault. It was immediately reinvested to purchase the manufactured goods needed to fund the very next cycle of the loop.
What is truly staggering to consider is how this specific triangulation permanently altered the global geography of commerce.
Before this era, the Atlantic Ocean was viewed as a terrifying, insurmountable barrier.
But the Portuguese trade loop transformed the Atlantic into a high-speed commercial highway.
For the first time in history, it integrated Europe, Africa, and the Americas into a single, highly interdependent economic organism.
However, the Portuguese dominance of this system carried a fatal structural flaw.
Right.
Despite the unimaginable wealth pouring into Lisbon, they became victims of what modern economists would diagnose as a severe resource curse, or what is sometimes called Dutch disease.
It is a classic macroeconomic trap. The sheer volume of liquid wealth flowing into Portugal from the sale of Brazilian sugar was so massive that it severely depressed any domestic incentive to innovate.
Why would a Portuguese investor risk capital trying to build a domestic textile mill or diversify their agricultural base?
Exactly, when they could just invest in the guaranteed astronomical returns of the sugar fleet.
So Portugal becomes entirely dependent on importing all their manufactured goods from Northern Europe to sustain their own empire.
They had the vast colonial territory, and they had engineered the brilliant logistical trade route.
But their total lack of domestic financial and industrial diversification made them acutely vulnerable.
Vulnerable specifically to the most financially sophisticated, aggressive, and well-capitalized entity of the early modern world.
Because if the Spanish had the territory and the Portuguese had the logistics, neither of them possessed the ultimate catalyst required for true industrial-scale acceleration.
To turn this prototype into a global machine required a financial revolution.
It required the entry of the Dutch Republic.
In 1621, the Dutch States General, their governing body, issues a charter creating the Dutch West India Company, or the WIC.
Now, it is vital to understand that the WIC was not just a trading firm.
No, it was a heavily militarized corporate monopoly.
It was granted a mandate by the state to wage war, disrupt the Spanish and Portuguese empires, and forcefully capture sugar-producing territories.
And their entry onto the global stage is nothing short of explosive.
In 1628, a Dutch admiral named Piet Hein executes what might be the most consequential maritime heist in history.
Off the coast of Cuba, he manages to capture the entire Spanish silver fleet.
We are talking about the annual convoy carrying the extracted wealth of the Americas back to Spain. Hein captures it intact.
The financial impact of that capture is almost impossible to overstate. It injected an astronomical 11.5 million guilders directly into the coffers of the WIC overnight.
What does 11.5 million guilders actually mean in 1628? What does that allow a corporation to do?
Well, it is a massive, unprecedented capitalization event. It provides the WIC with a war chest so large that they can fundamentally alter the geopolitical map.
Armed with that staggering venture capital, in 1630, the WIC launches a massive, decisive naval invasion of Brazil.
They successfully conquer Pernambuco, which was the absolute undisputed epicenter of global sugar production.
They don't just conquer and tax it. Under the administration of their governor, Prince John Maurice of Nassau, the Dutch turn this Brazilian territory into a high-tech laboratory.
This is where they engineer a technological leap that literally changes the world economy.
The crucial invention that was refined and perfected under Dutch administration was the vertical three-roller mill.
We really need to pause and explain the specific physics and mechanics of this mill, because it is the vital piece of technology that proves the industrialization argument.
Right, the older Spanish and Portuguese mills utilized two massive horizontal wooden rollers. They were terribly inefficient.
Highly inefficient and incredibly dangerous. With the horizontal two-roller design, the sugar cane had to be manually fed into the crushing mechanism.
Because the pressure was uneven, a single pass only extracted a fraction of the juice.
The mangled cane then had to be gathered, carried back to the front, and fed through a second or third time. It was slow, it constantly jammed, and the yield was poor.
The Dutch completely redesigned the physics of the extraction. The vertical three-roller mill utilized an intricate, heavy iron gearing system.
You had three massive vertical cylinders tightly synchronized.
Whether the mill was powered by a rushing river, a massive windmill, or teams of draft animals, the mechanics were the same.
A laborer feeds the raw cane in between the first and second rollers. As it passes through, the central gearing mechanism automatically catches the cane, violently redirects it, and pulls it backward through the tight space between the second and third rollers.
It allowed for continuous, synchronized, high-pressure crushing.
It required less manual handling, it rarely jammed, and it drastically improved both the total yield and the purity of the sugar juice extracted.
It was a masterpiece of mechanical engineering. In fact, this specific technological baseline was so efficient that it dominated the global sugar industry for the next 2 centuries.
Remaining the standard until the eventual arrival of steam power.
But the Dutch hegemony over the physical territory of Brazil is surprisingly short-lived.
Yes, by 1654, A fierce Luso-Brazilian insurgency manages to defeat the Dutch military and expel the WIC from Recife entirely.
So imagine the scenario in 1654. You have this massive, highly organized apparatus of Dutch merchants, specialized engineers, ship captains, and bankers.
They possess immense liquid capital, cutting-edge industrial technology, and unparalleled expertise in global logistics.
But suddenly they have no land. They've been evicted from the plantation.
They desperately need a new market to deploy all this capital and machinery.
And they find it in a small, struggling English colony in the Caribbean called Barbados.
This represents a pivotal watershed moment in global economic history. During the 1640s and early 1650s, Barbados was essentially a failing settlement.
The English colonists there were trying to grow tobacco, but the quality was poor, and they were being completely outcompeted by the massive tobacco yields coming out of Virginia.
The Dutch sail into Barbados, survey the situation, and act exactly like modern, aggressive venture capitalists.
They look at these struggling English farmers and say, "You have excellent soil and the perfect climate for sugar."
We have the 3 roller mills, we have the massive copper boiling vats, we control the transatlantic labor supply network.
And most importantly, we have the massive lines of credit required to build it all.
The English planters were eager, but the capital expenditures required to transition from a small tobacco farm to an industrial sugar complex were completely beyond their financial capacity.
A full-scale sugar works required a massive upfront investment.
So the Dutch merchants offered them highly structured, long-term credit on strict installment terms.
The Dutch essentially financed the complete, rapid transformation of the entire island of Barbados into a hyper-profitable industrial sugar monoculture.
But we have to examine the terrifying, real-world human consequences of those specific credit terms.
This debt structure created what historians refer to as the Barbados system. Walk us through the mechanics of how debt directly fueled the brutality on the ground.
It is a devastating chain of causality. Debt requires service. The interest is relentless.
The heavy financial obligations held by the Dutch creditors demanded the absolute maximum possible extraction from both the land and the laborers.
If a Barbadian planter experienced a poor harvest or a hurricane damaged his mill, he couldn't simply pause production or ask for leniency.
The interest compounded.
To avoid foreclosure, his only option was to borrow more capital from the Dutch, to purchase more enslaved human beings, to clear more land, to extract more sugar.
Which generated even more debt. It is a terrifying, inescapable feedback loop.
To meet these unyielding, mathematically rigid financial obligations, the English planters realized they had to extract labor with maximum efficiency.
They instituted a system of rigid, deeply violent, time-disciplined gang labor.
The entire enslaved population was divided into highly organized gangs based on physical strength.
The work in the fields was synchronized to the absolute limit of human endurance, driven by the whip and the clock.
It was the precise, calculated deployment of industrial time management, long before the factory whistles ever blew in Manchester.
Exactly. And while the Dutch engineered this financial and technological system in Barbados, the English rapidly internalized the model and eventually exported it to their much larger colony of Jamaica, vastly expanding its scale and brutality.
But this raises a fascinating geopolitical question.
If you map this out, the Dutch are the ones financing the colonial infrastructure. The Dutch are providing the cutting-edge machinery.
The Dutch are transporting the enslaved laborers.
And the Dutch ships are carrying the refined sugar back to European markets.
Which means the Dutch are the ones capturing the vast majority of the profit from the entire Atlantic enterprise.
Right. So how did the imperial capitals in London and Paris react when they finally realized that their own sovereign colonies, which they had fought to establish, were essentially functioning as highly efficient wealth-generating engines for the banks in Amsterdam?
They reacted with intense alarm, followed by coordinated, aggressive, mercantilist warfare.
By the mid-17th century, both the English Parliament and the French crown realized they were bleeding wealth.
They determined that they had to legally and physically sever the Dutch from the colonial trade network.
In England, we see the implementation of the Navigation Acts. This wasn't just a single law. It was a series of massive legislative strikes passed in 1651, 1660, 1663, and 1673.
This was essentially the English government attempting to build an impenetrable legal fortress around its entire imperial economy.
The core mechanism of the Navigation Acts was incredibly strict.
The laws explicitly stipulated that any goods flowing into or out of an English colony had to travel exclusively on English-built ships, owned by English subjects, and manned by predominantly English crews.
Put yourself in the shoes of a ship captain or a planter in the 1660s to understand how radical this was.
Furthermore, the English introduced the legal concept of enumerated goods.
These were the highest value commodities: sugar, indigo, cotton, tobacco.
Under the law, a planter in Jamaica could not sell his sugar to the highest bidder. He was legally required to export it directly to England or to another English colony.
It became explicitly criminally illegal for a Barbadian planter to buy a much-needed enslaved laborer from a Dutch merchant, or to load a single barrel of sugar onto a cheaper, more efficient Dutch cargo hull.
And France followed suit with an equally draconian protectionist policy known as l'exclusif.
It operated on the exact same premise. It forced all French colonial wealth, every pound of sugar or coffee, to be routed strictly to metropolitan French ports, carried exclusively on French vessels.
And both the British and the French deployed their rapidly expanding naval power to ruthlessly enforce these monopolies, seizing any foreign ships caught in their waters.
So we have a fascinating scenario. The premier financial and logistical superpower of the Atlantic world, the Dutch Republic, is suddenly legally locked out of the very agro-industrial industries it spent decades helping to build.
But a financial hegemon with that much capital does not simply shrug its shoulders and surrender.
How did the Dutch respond?
They pivoted, and their pivot was brilliant, subversive, and incredibly lucrative.
They utilized a tiny, seemingly insignificant 21-square-kilometer island in the northeastern Caribbean called Saint Eustatius.
If you look at Saint Eustatius on a map, it makes no sense as an economic powerhouse.
It had no rivers, poor soil, and absolutely no significant natural resources of its own. It couldn't grow sugar.
But the Dutch government made one crucial administrative decision. They declared the entire island a free port.
They completely abolished all customs duties and taxes.
That single legal distinction rapidly transformed Saint Eustatius into the undisputed contraband capital of the Atlantic world.
What occurred there is a masterclass in 18th century international smuggling and money laundering.
You have to remember, the French and English planters despised the Navigation Acts and l'exclusif.
They were suffocating under the heavy taxes, the artificially low prices dictated by their mother countries, and the chronic shortages of enslaved labor caused by the monopolies.
So the planters systematically bypassed their own governments.
The logistics of this operation are astounding. The Dutch built over 600 massive stone warehouses lining the beach of Oranjestad Bay on Saint Eustatius.
Let's walk through exactly how this smuggling mechanism operated on the water. Imagine an English planter in Antigua has a surplus of sugar, but the English merchant ships are offering a terrible price.
In the dead of night, he loads his sugar onto small, fast coastal vessels.
They sail the short distance to Saint Eustatius and unload the cargo into one of those 600 warehouses.
A Dutch merchant purchases the sugar, paying the planter in hard currency or cheaper enslaved laborers.
Then, the Dutch merchant literally changes the paperwork. He records the English sugar as local produce, rebrands it, loads it onto a massive Dutch East Indiaman, and exports it across the Atlantic as a completely legitimate Dutch commodity.
Entirely bypassing the British tax authorities.
It was a monumental loophole in the mercantilist system. At its commercial zenith in the late 18th century, this tiny, barren rock was seeing up to 3,500 ships arriving in its harbor annually.
It functioned not merely as a massive sugar laundering hub, but as the premier tax-free clearinghouse for the intra-Caribbean slave trade.
If a French planter in Martinique was deeply in debt and facing foreclosure, he could quickly smuggle a portion of his enslaved workforce to Saint Eustatius, liquidate them for hard cash with a Dutch broker, and return home with the funds.
Entirely circumventing the imperial tax structures and creditors of Paris.
It is incredible. The grand, heavily fortified mercantilist architecture designed by the superpowers in London and Paris was, in reality, highly porous.
The black market was effectively the real market.
Saint Eustatius remained this massive, humming loophole in the global economy until it was finally invaded, sacked, and permanently shut down by British Admiral George Rodney during the American Revolutionary War in 1781.
We have spent a considerable amount of time tracing the evolution of the heavy technology, the complex international financing, and the massive smuggling networks.
But to truly grasp the monumental scale of the wealth this machinery was generating, we have to pause and correct a massive geographical misconception.
A misconception that heavily distorts how we view this era today. This is a critical point of re-education for you as a listener.
If you grew up in the United States, or even if you just consume popular history, there is an entrenched, almost unshakable assumption that the North American mainland, places like the Massachusetts Bay Colony or Jamestown, Virginia, was the natural center of gravity in the colonial world.
It is a pervasive myth. But if you look at the primary documents from the perspective of the European imperial planners and financiers in the 17th and 18th centuries, that assumption is fundamentally false.
North America was the periphery. The Caribbean was the absolute center of the economic universe.
Let's look at the hard demographic data to prove it. Take the period of early English expansion between the 1630s and the 1660s.
During those 3 decades, more English migrants packed up their lives and traveled to the 166-square-mile island of Barbados than to the expansive mainland colonies of Massachusetts and Virginia combined.
The European migration numbers clearly reflect where the actual economic priorities lay. Everyone wanted to get to the Sugar Islands because that was where the spectacular fortunes were being made.
However, we have to address why the Caribbean populations did not explode with massive, permanent European settler societies.
The reason is catastrophic mortality rates.
The tropical environment was epidemiologically hostile to European immune systems. Outbreaks of yellow fever and malaria routinely decimated the newly arrived populations.
The people who migrated there did so with the intention of accumulating immense wealth rapidly and then fleeing back to London to live as absentee landlords.
The vast majority perished before they could establish sustainable communities.
In stark contrast, the colder, harsher climate of New England allowed for much higher survival rates, enabling those settler populations to actually compound over time through natural reproduction.
But if we look at the horrifying systemic statistics of the transatlantic slave trade, the geographic reality of where the capital was flowing becomes undeniable.
The historical consensus indicates that roughly 12.5 million enslaved Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic.
Of that staggering number, only about 4 to 5% were sent to North America.
That statistic always stops people in their tracks, only 4 to 5% to North America.
Yes, over 40% were destined for the intense extraction of the Caribbean sugar islands, and another 40% were sent to the sugar and mining operations of Brazil.
To put the sheer density of this extraction into perspective, the French colony of Saint-Domingue alone imported an estimated 800,000 enslaved individuals over its history.
That is nearly double the total number of enslaved people brought to the entire massive territory that would eventually become the United States.
And economically, the disparity in value is just as stark. By the 1770s, right on the eve of the American Revolution, if you combine the export value of the British Caribbean islands, Jamaica, Antigua, Barbados,
it was roughly double the total export value of all 13 North American mainland colonies combined.
the tiny islands were vastly outproducing the massive continent.
Perhaps the most illustrative, almost comical anecdote of this Caribbean primacy occurred in the diplomatic halls of Europe at the conclusion of the 7 Years' War in 1763.
The British had won a massive global victory.
During the peace negotiations in Paris, the British essentially offered the defeated French a choice. France could retain its vast continental territorial claim of Canada, or it could keep the tiny 600-square-mile Caribbean sugar island of Guadeloupe, which the British military had occupied during the war.
And the French diplomats hand over the entirety of the Canadian landmass without a second thought.
The famous Enlightenment philosopher Voltaire publicly mocked the British for fighting over Canada, dismissing the entire continent as quelques arpents de neige, just a few acres of snow.
The French happily chose to keep Guadeloupe because that tiny island was an unparalleled, highly efficient, cash-generating machine. Canada was viewed as an expensive, frozen liability.
If we extrapolate this and connect it to the bigger picture of institutional development, the long-term consequences of this economic disparity are profound.
North America, precisely because it was less immediately lucrative and lacked a hyper-valuable cash crop like sugar, benefited from what historians call salutary neglect.
The British Crown largely ignored the mainland colonies for decades.
And that neglect was a massive blessing in disguise. Because London wasn't obsessively micromanaging them, the mainland colonies were forced to develop robust local banking systems, diversified maritime industries.
Local universities like Harvard and Yale and self-sustaining agricultural networks, they built complex internal infrastructure.
Meanwhile, the Caribbean was far too valuable to ever be ignored. It was subjected to the purest, most ruthless form of extractive capitalism.
All of the immense, staggering wealth generated in places like Jamaica or Barbados flowed straight out of the colonies, across the Atlantic, and directly into the banks of London, Paris, and Amsterdam.
Virtually nothing was left behind or reinvested into local institutional development.
It is a profound, tragic historical irony. The extraordinary, unparalleled wealth of the 18th century Caribbean condemned it to long-term institutional underdevelopment.
While the comparative poverty and neglect of North America quietly created the structural conditions for its future emergence as a diversified global power.
Exactly. And to examine the absolute zenith of this extractive capitalist machine, to see it operating at its most extreme hyper-financialized state, we must narrow our focus to the undisputed crown jewel of the Atlantic world.
The French colony of Saint-Domingue. Through the Treaty of Ryswick in 1697, France formally acquired the western third of the island of Hispaniola from Spain.
Over the course of the next century, the French managed to transform this rugged, mountainous, heavily forested frontier into the most intensely cultivated and profitable piece of real estate on the planet.
By the late 1700s, Saint-Domingue is single-handedly producing roughly 40% of the sugar and 60% of the coffee consumed by the entire continent of Europe.
But transforming a wild frontier into an industrial powerhouse required a staggering, unprecedented influx of capital.
Jungles had to be cleared, massive stone aqueducts had to be built, and thousands of enslaved laborers had to be purchased.
And crucially, at the dawn of the 18th century, the French state was broke. They were essentially bankrupt.
Their treasury was completely crippled by the endless, expensive dynastic wars waged by King Louis XIV.
The French crown simply did not have the liquidity to fund the initial capitalization of Saint-Domingue.
So once again, history repeats itself. The Dutch merchants stepped quietly back into the frame.
Between 1690 and 1720, in open, flagrant defiance of the strict French exclusive laws, early French colonial officers and pioneering planters forged clandestine, highly lucrative financing arrangements with Dutch mercantile houses.
Dutch venture capital secretly bankrolls the initial heady infrastructure of Saint-Domingue.
As this immense foreign capital poured into the colony, it crystallized a highly stratified, legally enforced, and uniquely complex social architecture.
In the French Caribbean, this brutal hierarchy was meticulously codified by a piece of royal legislation known as the Code Noir, or the Black Code, originally issued in 1685.
We must carefully unpack the four distinct tiers of this colonial society to understand why it became such an explosive demographic powder keg.
Let's break down the social pyramid. At the very apex, holding supreme social status, you have the Grand Blanc.
These are the elite, immensely wealthy white sugar lords.
They are a tiny fraction of the population, but they own the roughly 800 large-scale, hyper-capitalized sugar estates positioned on the fertile coastal plains.
They're the ones driving the massive export economy.
Just below them in social standing, but vastly different in economic reality, are the Petits Blancs.
These are the working-class white colonists. The tradesmen, the artisans, the brutal plantation overseers, and the smaller landowners.
They managed approximately 5,700 smaller estates, largely positioned in the hills, and dedicated to less capital-intensive crops like indigo, cotton, and eventually coffee.
Then we have the most socially disruptive and structurally fascinating demographic in the colony, the gens de couleur libre, or the free people of color.
These were emancipated individuals, often mixed-race Creoles.
Now, despite facing severe, intensely codified legal and social discrimination from the white populations, this specific group managed to amass immense economic power.
It is a dynamic unique to Saint-Domingue. By the late 18th century, the gens de couleur libre owned approximately 6,000 plantations, primarily dominating the booming coffee industry in the mountainous interior.
They collectively owned more physical estates and controlled more land than the entire Petit Blancs population.
Many were incredibly wealthy, highly educated in France, and were themselves massive owners of enslaved labor.
And finally, at the massive base of this economic pyramid, physically sustaining the immense wealth of every single tier above them, were the enslaved Africans.
Approximately 500,000 individuals by the late 1780s who systematically extracted labor maintained the entire global structure.
I have to emphasize how fundamentally different this French tripartite model was from other imperial systems of the era.
In the British Caribbean, like Jamaica, you had massive absentee ownership. The incredibly wealthy planters preferred to live in luxurious townhouses in London and hired local managers to run their estates.
The demographic was mostly enslaved people and a few white managers.
The Spanish system utilized the castas, a highly graduated, complex hierarchy of racial classification with dozens of intermediate categories, allowing for a much larger proportion of free mixed-race smallholders.
What made the social architecture of Saint-Domingue uniquely volatile was the lethal combination of its demographic math and its distribution of wealth.
You have a colony where the brutally oppressed enslaved population outnumbers the free population by 10 to 1.
Simultaneously, you have a deeply marginalized class, the free people of color, who hold massive, undeniable economic power and plantation wealth, yet are entirely denied the basic political rights and social equality that such wealth would traditionally secure in Europe.
It is a societal pressure cooker without a pressure valve. But let's return to the economic engine driving the society. How exactly did those top 800 grand blank estates achieve such a staggering state of hypercapitalization?
The physical infrastructure required for that level of industrial dominance, the miles of stone aqueducts, the massive milling complexes, is monumental.
To answer that, we must shift our focus away from the Caribbean, back across the Atlantic to Paris, to the highest realms of European finance.
And examine one of the most spectacular, disastrous financial schemes in human history.
Enter a man named John Law. He is a Scottish economist, a brilliant statistician, and arguably a financial genius.
In 1716, the French regent appoints Law to solve the absolute nightmare that was France's sovereign debt crisis following the death of Louis XIV.
The country is drowning in war debt, and the traditional taxation systems have completely failed.
Law's solution is radical and entirely revolutionary for its time. He establishes the Banque Générale, which becomes the very first national bank in France authorized to issue paper money backed by the state.
Shortly after that, he creates the Mississippi Company. This is a massive, state-sponsored joint stock monopoly.
The Crown grants Law's company total, exclusive control over all French overseas commerce.
Think about the sheer scale of that monopoly. The Mississippi Company controlled the administration of the vast Louisiana Territory in North America. They controlled the entire lucrative trade of Saint-Domingue, and they held the absolute monopoly rights to the French transatlantic slave trade.
It was a corporate behemoth.
I want to view what happens next through the analytical framework provided by financial historian Edward Chancellor.
Chancellor argues that when sovereign debt reaches critical, unsustainable levels and a central authority steps in to artificially suppress interest rates to manage that debt, it reliably triggers a speculative mania.
Capital flees traditional safe haven investments because the returns are too low, and it violently pours into high-risk, high-yield markets.
In the early 18th century, the ultimate high-yield, high-risk market was the Caribbean sugar and slave economy.
And John Law perfectly engineered that mania. He utilized the Royal Bank to print and issue vast quantities of paper money.
He used that paper money to drive a frenzied nationwide public speculation in the shares of the Mississippi Company.
The share prices skyrocketed, but the paper money supply was expanding exponentially, rapidly outpacing the actual value of any physical gold or silver reserves held by the bank.
This produced rampant, terrifying hyperinflation across the French economy.
It is the classic anatomy of a financial bubble. People are buying shares solely because the price is going up, funded by printed money.
And inevitably, in 1720, the Mississippi bubble bursts spectacularly. The panic sets in, everyone tries to convert their paper shares back into gold, the bank suspends payment, and the entire system collapses.
Wiping out massive aristocratic fortunes and plunging France into a severe, decades-long economic depression.
But here's the incredible structural irony of the whole situation. The paper wealth vanished into thin air, but the physical infrastructure did not.
Exactly. Before the crash occurred, John Law had successfully deployed billions of those inflated paper levers to fund actual, durable, physical capital expenditures across the French Empire.
The printed money was used to build massive fleets of cargo ships, to clear thousands of acres of dense jungle for new sugar plantations in Saint-Domingue,
To heavily fortify slave trading outposts on the West African coast, and to fund the initial founding of the city of New Orleans in North America in 1718.
It's an astonishing realization. The French public, through the mechanism of this disastrous financial bubble, had completely involuntarily crowdfunded the heavy physical infrastructure of a global empire.
And this devastating financial crash left a permanent psychological and structural imprint on the Caribbean economy.
MIT historian Malik Gachem refers to Saint-Domingue as a bubble colony.
Following the absolute financial ruin of 1720, French metropolitan investors and the colonial planters realized that their only possible path to recovering their lost inflated wealth was through aggressively expanding high-yield cash crop production.
They internalized the frantic, high-stakes financial logic of the bubble.
The operating model for plantation management in Saint-Domingue became structurally reliant on massive debt and aggressive, relentless capitalization.
The planters pushed the brutal pace of sugar extraction to its absolute horrifying physical limits solely because they had to service the immense compounding debts they owed to metropolitan financiers in Europe who were trying to recoup their bubble losses.
Which naturally leads us to track where all that extracted wealth was actually flowing.
We need to examine the physical European cities that grew extraordinarily wealthy, managing this continuous heavy flow of capital and commodities.
Let's map out the logistics of this transoceanic machine. In Saint-Domingue, the colonial nerve center is the port city of Cap Français on the northern coast.
This is the massive bottleneck. It is the primary harbor through which the vast majority of the colonies extracted sugar and coffee exits, and through which manufactured goods and thousands of enslaved laborers enter.
Directly across the Atlantic in metropolitan France, the city of Nantes emerges as the undisputed epicenter of human trafficking.
Operating with heavy royal subsidies and facing absolutely zero moral censure from the church or the state, the maritime merchants of Nantes organized an astonishing 1,744 slaving expeditions over the century.
The merchants of this single city alone accounted for over 41% of the total French transatlantic slave trade.
And while Nantes handled the horrific logistics of the labor supply, the city of Bordeaux became the beating heart of the sugar import and re-export economy.
If you walk along the waterfront of Bordeaux today, the grand, lavish 18th century architecture lining the river was almost entirely underwritten by colonial extraction.
But here is the fascinating macroeconomic detail. Bordeaux wasn't just importing sugar for French bakers.
Over 70% of the raw colonial sugar entering France was immediately re-exported from Bordeaux to highly lucrative markets in Holland, Germany, and Northern Europe.
If we look closely at who is managing those re-exports, we find that the massive capital flowing through these French ports was not exclusively French.
Remember, the strict mercantilist laws of l'exclusive legally barred foreigners from directly participating in the colonial trade.
So wealthy European financiers simply found a loophole. They embedded themselves directly into the French port cities through naturalization and highly strategic marriages.
A perfect example of this cross-border integration is the Bethmann banking family of Frankfurt.
Johann Philipp and Simon Moritz Bethmann had built a massive, highly respected financial institution in Germany.
Recognizing the immense profits of the colonial trade, but legally barred from it, they send Johann Jakob Bethmann to relocate to Bordeaux in 1740.
He strategically marries into the local French shipping elite, instantly gaining access to the Caribbean markets.
Through the operations of the Bethmanns, we can clearly see how deeply the German hinterland, hundreds of miles from the Atlantic, was integrated into this global machine.
The Bethmann Bank aggressively financed proto-industrial enterprises across Germany, specifically to supply the slave economy.
For example, massive German manufacturing centers produced cheap, coarse linens known as Osnabrüs.
These were exported by the ton, specifically to serve as the minimal clothing provided to the enslaved laborers in the Caribbean.
Simultaneously, the bank controlled massive Saxon copper mines that supplied the essential raw materials for Atlantic shipbuilding and the giant colonial boiling vats.
It's a completely integrated trans-European supply chain. Prominent, wealthy planters sitting in their mansions in Saint-Domingue literally maintained their primary bank accounts directly with the Bethmanns in Frankfurt.
The scale of this corporate hegemony is staggering. Let's look at the firm of Romberg, Bapst & C., founded in Bordeaux in 1783 by a man named Friedrich Romberg.
Romberg's commercial empire is the ultimate manifestation of absentee, highly diversified corporate plantation management.
His massive portfolio included a cotton manufacturing plant in Brussels, a highly profitable maritime insurance company operating out of Bruges, a permanent, privately owned fleet of slaving vessels,
And the direct financial ownership or management of roughly 20 large-scale plantations in Saint-Domingue. He is operating a multinational conglomerate.
And when Romberg engages in some highly leveraged, bad business practices and nears total bankruptcy in 1789, what happens?
The free market doesn't let him fail. Johann Jakob Bethmann orchestrates a massive consortium of Bordeaux trading houses to bail him out with an astronomical 4.15 million livre injection.
Why do they save him? Because a colonial enterprise of that magnitude, heavily integrated into the banking system, was deemed too big to fail.
The systemic risk to the European financial network was simply too great to allow a collapse. The shockwaves would have ruined dozens of banks.
But for all its highly sophisticated European financing and complex insurance schemes, this incredibly lucrative global machine harbored a critical, potentially fatal logistical flaw.
Yes, the fundamental vulnerability of monoculture. When an island's territory becomes so insanely valuable for growing high-yield cash crops like sugar and coffee, the planters refuse to waste a single acre growing low-value crops like food or timber.
Which means a colony entirely dedicated to feeding Europe's sugar addiction cannot physically feed its own population, nor can it harvest the wood required to build the thousands of barrels needed to ship its own product.
To survive, the entire Caribbean sugar complex required a massive, continuous external provisioning artery. They needed an outside source of basic survival goods.
Enter the North American mainland colonies, specifically the maritime merchants of New England.
The merchants operating out of Massachusetts and Rhode Island stepped into this logistical void to become the indispensable supply chain of the Caribbean.
They exported massive, continuous quantities of timber for barrel staves, thousands of horses to power the animal-driven trappishes on the smaller states, and tons of cheap, salted fish to provide a baseline protein source to sustain the heavily worked enslaved labor force.
In exchange for providing these absolutely vital provisions, the New England merchant ships were loaded with molasses.
Molasses is the primary, heavily abundant, and relatively cheap byproduct of the sugar refining process.
And this massive influx of cheap Caribbean molasses ignites a secondary, massive industrial boom back in North America: rum distillation.
Rhode Island, geographically the smallest of the mainland colonies, radically transforms itself into the largest North American participant in the transatlantic slave trade.
They imported the molasses, distilled it into highly potent rum in massive factories, and then shipped that rum directly to the West African coast.
The rum functioned as a highly liquid, in-demand currency used to purchase more enslaved human beings.
The moral and financial complexities of this specific North American triangle are deeply profound, and they are perhaps best illustrated by examining the history of the Brown family of Providence, Rhode Island.
The Browns, Nicholas, Joseph, John, and Moses operated a highly diversified, immensely powerful mercantile empire.
Their portfolio included iron furnaces, spermaceti candle factories, and a massive, highly profitable rum distillery.
In 1764, the Browns decide to directly enter the human trafficking market. They launch a slaving expedition, outfitting a ship named the Sally.
They send it across the Atlantic to West Africa, loaded with over 17,000 gallons of New England rum.
The voyage of the Sally was an unmitigated, horrific catastrophe. The vast majority of the enslaved people forced aboard died of disease during the terrifying conditions of the Middle Passage.
Many others were killed when they courageously attempted an armed shipboard uprising against the crew.
The severe financial loss, combined with the sheer, undeniable human tragedy of the Sally expedition, forces a profound moral fracture right down the center of the Brown family.
Moses Brown is so deeply traumatized and affected by the reality of what they have done that he renounces the slave trade entirely.
In 1773, he officially manumits his own enslaved laborers and becomes one of New England's most vocal, aggressive, and consequential abolitionists.
But his brother, John Brown, remains entirely unrepentant. John continues to aggressively mount slaving voyages for decades, prioritizing the immense, undeniable profits of the trade over any moral consideration or changing public sentiment.
This bitter fraternal schism leads to an extraordinary, highly symbolic legal showdown. In 1797, Moses Brown, utilizing his powerful position in the Providence Abolition Society, actually orchestrates the federal seizure of his own brother's slaving ship, the Hope.
Moses actively prosecutes John Brown under the newly established U.S. Slave Trade Act of 1794.
John Brown, one of the wealthiest men in America, becomes the very first American citizen prosecuted in federal court for illegal slave trading, and the prosecution is driven largely by his own brother.
It perfectly encapsulates how deeply and inextricably embedded the slave economy was in the fundamental fabric of American nation-building, tearing even the most prominent elite families apart.
And it certainly wasn't just the Browns. The Cabot family of Massachusetts built immense generational fortunes, systematically smuggling Caribbean molasses and directly trading enslaved people.
They took that accumulated wealth, leveraged it into formidable political power, and eventually helped introduce the highly controversial First Fugitive Slave Act in 1793.
And the staggering wealth generated by this North American provisioning and slaving network didn't just stay in the Atlantic basin. It provided the massive seed capital required for American global expansion.
Elite merchants like Thomas H. Perkins of Boston and John Jacob Astor took the massive liquid fortunes they had built in the Caribbean trade and redirected them to the other side of the world, forcefully entering the highly lucrative, high-risk China trade.
We can call this the Canton Connection. The Atlantic sugar economy functioned as the first truly globalized financial system.
The capital brutally extracted from the forced labor in Saint-Domingue was laundered through the roaring rum distilleries of Providence and eventually found its way into the elite counting houses of Canton.
We even have incredible primary records of a highly prominent Chinese Hong merchant, Pan Chongyao, known to the Americans as Consequa, writing a formal letter directly to U.S. President James Madison in 1814.
He was seeking federal assistance to recover massive financial debts owed to him by American merchants. Those massive American mercantile operations in China were originally bankrolled by the capital generated in the Atlantic plantation complex.
So let's step back and look at the vast architecture we have traced today. We have examined the profound technological leap of the Dutch three-roller mill.
We've dissected the hyper-financialization and the lasting structural debt of John Law's Mississippi bubble.
We've mapped the deep cross-border integration of European banking houses like the Bethmans.
And we've exposed the indispensable logistical and moral complicity of the North American provisioning trade.
This brings us to the pinnacle of our historical analysis.
By the year 1791, the Atlantic sugar economy had reached a state of extraordinary, unprecedented productive efficiency.
Saint-Domingue stood at the absolute zenith of this massive global machine. It was a heavily financialized, hyper-productive industrial complex operating at maximum capacity.
To view the Industrial Revolution as a phenomenon that only began with steam looms in 19th century England is a profound, fundamental failure of historical memory.
The Caribbean sugar plantation was the true prototype. It successfully synthesized continuous mass production, strict industrial time discipline, high-risk venture capital, highly securitized debt, and global corporate absentee ownership centuries earlier.
But as we close this deep dive, we must return to the grave, solemn reality we established at the very beginning of our discussion.
This staggering concentration of global wealth, the grand limestone mansions of Bordeaux, the bustling, wealthy docks of Nantes, the elite Ivy League institutions of Providence, was balanced precariously upon an abyss of absolute human suffering.
The entire interconnected global architecture was entirely reliant on the systemic daily subjugation of millions of human beings.
And specifically in Saint-Domingue, that unrelenting subjugation had forged a demographic and social structure of unresolvable, terrifying tension.
You have a massive colony populated by 500,000 enslaved people whose daily lives are defined by horrific, lethal extraction.
Above them, a class of deeply indebted grands blancs, desperate to meet the merciless production yields demanded by European banks.
And alongside them, a massive, powerful population of gens de couleur libre who wield immense plantation wealth, but are violently marginalized and oppressed by colonial law.
The underlying mathematics of that society were fundamentally, explosively unsustainable.
The global financial machine had hit its absolute zenith. It was producing more wealth than at any point in human history.
But the foundation it rested upon was a massive demographic powder keg. And on the night of August 22, 1791, in the dark, heavily forested mountains above Cap Français, the deep structural contradictions of this centuries-old system reached a point of critical, violent instability.
The global financial machine was humming flawlessly, but the powder keg was about to ignite.
But what happens when the most profitable colony in the history of human civilization suddenly stops producing?
How does the sudden, complete destruction of this immense global capital permanently alter the map of the world?
That explosive bust cycle and its profound, far-reaching global fallout will be the subject of our next deep dive.